Playing retro games nowadays is certainly a lot more involved than it was when retro games were new. Back then, it was as simple as picking up a console for like 20 bucks, a couple of games for 5 to 10 a piece, and you're good to go. Today, playing retro games is a lot more elaborate that starts with the simple question, play on consoles or emulators? The answer is that it doesn't matter. To me, all that matters for all gamers is that the games remain playable in a comfortable enough format. It's interesting today as both consoles and emulators are constantly seeing updates, improvements, enhancements, and features. I come from an interesting background as I've dabbled in all sorts of ways to play retro games. Throughout the years, I've felt many of the pros and cons that come from playing retro games on original hardware they released on, and emulators that carry the torch. When it comes to what's better, like I said, it doesn't matter. What matters are the games and keeping them as accessible as possible. With that said, games have a lot more to consider compared to other media. You have the controller, the technical specs like resolution and frame rate. The display itself can have a big impact on games. Especially for those who want to get into retro games, it's a lot more complicated now. You can't exactly just tell someone to nab a console and some games and have at it. Retro materials will continue to get more costly. In that way, it makes emulators extremely attractive. The fact that, for the most part, it's free. But the thing that I reckon most would be surprised about is still how alienating emulation can be for a lot of casual gamers. At least computer emulation, which is what I'm mostly referring to. Emulation on consoles, or at least official emulation on consoles, is more comprehensible than more unofficial means. Computer language is still something that a lot of normal, regular casual gamers might not be comfortable with. Telling someone to just install and play on an emulator sounds a lot more intimidating for most casual gamers than plug in the system and put the game in. There's a raw simplicity in setting up a device that your average person is more comfortable with. Not to say it can't be a hassle, but still easier to understand. That's not to give consoles too much credit. If you want to play games from several systems, then it can quickly get quite precarious. The novelty of playing on consoles can only go so far when you're juggling multiple systems of multiple cables, all connecting to one or more displays. As someone who usually prefers to play on consoles, I'll admit, nowadays it takes some investment and dedication to maintain an ideal setup. With these older systems continuing to age, the likelihood of them prevailing in the long term dwindles. I'm lucky to have most of my systems remain perfectly functional, but I still dread the moment any one of them requires service of some kind. With my current setup, I've tried to organize it to be as convenient and quick access as possible, to make playing retro games more seamless compared to computer emulation, or at least as seamless as computer emulation. For all my 240p systems like the NES, Super NES, N64, and PS1, as well as my PS2, I have good quality SCART cables connected to them. I use SCART because I've had most of these systems serviced for better video quality, and SCART is the connection type that works best for me personally. The SCART cables are then fed to a SCART splitting device, a device that's not exactly cheap, but provides a great feature for me, with one signal being split into a professional video scaler, in this case the RetroTink 5X. A good video scaler is pretty much essential for retro consoles on newer TVs, as newer TVs either don't have the right video connections anymore, or if they do, then the games will look like total shit, along with ass loads of input lag that would ruin most retro games. With my systems either modded for RGB output or natively has RGB output, combined with the video scaler, then I'll have emulator quality sharp pixels from the original console, which still feels really good to me. There's just something about playing on original hardware that hits differently. Now, if I want an even more authentic feel, then I have the other SCART signal split into a SCART to component adapter, which then leads to a Sony Trinitron, which could be any cheap CRT TV. A great many would insist that retro games should be experienced with CRT-like visuals for a plethora of valid reasons, and you can't get much better than a real CRT. The SCART splitter then allows me to play on a CRT while also capturing sharp video output, because CRT-like filters aren't exactly attractive in a direct capture environment. But for playing on an actual HD TV, then CRT filters, like the ones the RetroTink 5X has, can look quite stunning, especially with other settings like HDR and BFI to further replicate the visual experience of a CRT. The games themselves are also important and probably the most costly effort now for retro gaming, as the demand is higher than ever, and so cost is higher than ever. I don't really collect retro games anymore, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend most to either, unless you're really passionate about some retro games. I already have all the games I'd want to own, and if I were to ever go back to them, then the real deal cartridge or disc is how I'll do it. But if I don't own a game I want to play, then there's more nefarious methods on offer. Cartridge-based consoles now have flash cards available, allowing to play games off an SD card. And that extra bit of convenience to load up any game without swapping games off a shelf can go a very long way. These flash cards aren't exactly cheap, but for the quality on offer and depending on how many games you want to play, then it's a worthwhile investment. For disc systems, it's a little more tricky, but at least for GameCube and Wii, there's easy homebrew methods like Swiss and USB Loader GX to boot up any game you want without hunting down original copies. Controllers are very important to me, and I can be one picky son of a bitch when it comes to using a proper controller. I'm so dedicated that I've invested a lot into getting all the Nintendo wireless controllers for Switch Online, along with adapters to use them on original hardware. That way I get that fresh, authentic controller feel with the convenience of wireless connectivity, though it was quite expensive to be fair. All this investment, from the games I already own to methods for games I don't own, on consoles I've had serviced, connected to professional scaling and splitting equipment, using wireless controllers with adapters to play my favorite retro games with sharp pixel output or on a CRT on original real hardware. This is compared to having an emulator and games within one folder on a computer using any basic Bluetooth controller I have lying around with sharp pixels or slapping on a good CRT filter. As a proponent of convenience, it's hard not to side with emulators. Granted, the consoles were a lot of work, but like any project, it's the end result that matters. I put in a lot of work to make playing these retro games as quick and accessible as possible because I still believe there's something that hits different when playing OG hardware. With that said, I still recognize emulators as the smart retro game method today. Last year, my PS1 died on me. I never found out what was wrong. I found a blown fuse, soldered on a new one, and it blew again after powering on. I tried replacing all the capacitors, which is one of the most common refurbishing steps, but to no success. I settled on simply getting another PS1 and saving to hopefully have the old one professionally serviced at a later date. It was in that moment of complete, absolute failure to save a console that comfort was found in the emulator DuckStation. It's one of those things of not having to worry about a console failing or a game no longer booting is what makes emulators so reliable. That's not to say emulators don't have their own set of potential issues. Of course, it depends on the emulator, and it goes without saying that the newer the console, the less reliable the emulator may potentially be. It would help to have enough computer intuition in order to diagnose potential issues and how to resolve them. But still, as long as a game can be perfectly playable from start to finish with as few hiccups as possible, then emulators are the preferred method. Regarding how I play emulators, I feel I should explain myself a little more, as a number of you were quite exacerbated at my preference to keep the experience as vanilla as possible when using emulation. Don't get me wrong, I love messing around with emulation enhancements. It's a very cool way to boost the experience in ways that were never possible before. If you prefer to jack up resolutions, download fan texture packs, use frame rate patches when available, and if you feel it greatly improves the gaming experience, then that's awesome. Anything that'll help you enjoy a game as much as possible is all good in my book, but for me, I prefer to let the game speak for itself and to be fair to the game by playing by its rules and limitations. A good game that's well designed should be able to stand strong even with older limitations. The only emulation feature I'll probably use is save states, as many older games, especially on NES, can be far too punishing with making the player redo lots of progress, or the game won't even have saving to begin with. So save states are just fine with me, and I will use them if it helps, though the trick with save states is to use them in moderation. In my experience, the game feels more like mindless busy work if you overuse save states, which isn't fair to the game in my opinion. I still try to avoid save states if the game is well designed enough. As far as texture packs go, again, I want to be fair to the game and its visuals, and to view the game as it originally looked. Plus, and I'm very sorry to say, so I say as respectively as I can, but I don't like the majority of fan texture packs. A good number of you erroneously told me to just download a texture pack like it automatically saves the visuals. Look, I respect and admire the effort many fans put in to try to improve the visuals in games they are passionate about. But I'm sorry, most of the time, it really doesn't look that good in my opinion. Maybe I'll explain more in detail in another video. As far as basic emulator settings go, Yeah, I like to keep things basic. DuckStation allows for all sorts of visual tweaks. There's so much to consider, like increased resolution, downsampling higher res, removing texture filtering, removing the PS1 geometry wobble, and so much more. It's fun to tinker with and to see games presented in a way that they never could before, but if I'm dedicating a playthrough of a game through an emulator, I prefer to leave those enhancements off. I think it's more fair to the game to play in a way closer to how it was originally experienced. My visual preference mostly lies in having a sharp pixel output at native res, as I feel soft pixels aren't the most attractive, or CRT-like visuals, which is different than just softening the pixels. CRT displays and CRT mask filters is a much more complex process. It's not just softening the image, it's the blending of light and colors to trick your eye into seeing more detail than what was originally there. Between the two, I prefer CRT visuals over sharp pixels, but I'm happy with either if the other is no option. Sharp pixels is an emulator staple. I like sharp pixels as I feel it's a good compromise between the lower detail while still maintaining a visually clean image. Plus, it's not like sharp pixels are inherently less authentic. It's how many games were presented in either cover art or manuals. Plus, many of these older consoles natively output such a clean image that all it takes is a competent scaler to view the sharp pixels in all their glory. So getting sharp pixels in emulators is as simple as setting a higher native res in 2D games, or using some kind of nearest neighbor setting in 3D games. Dolphin recently updated to have resampling, which gives me sharp pixels at native res, and I'm still in awe with it. CRT-like visuals is certainly more tricky, but manageable. For consoles, I have a CRT, so I'm good to go. If I didn't, CRT filters on scalers have gotten so good that my friend who frequently works on CRTs admits that he'd prefer these filters on a good 4K TV because CRTs can be, at best, a massive pain in the ass. A good 4K TV is also, to me, necessary for filters like these. I've recently managed to acquire a 65-inch LG OLED. HDR does a lot to replicate the bright luminance of CRTs, and black frame insertion does a lot to replicate a CRT's motion clarity. It's not necessary for those with an untrained eye, but I don't have an untrained eye anymore. On PC, the best CRT filter I've seen is CRT Royale. It was exclusive to RetroArch for a while, but was thankfully ported to Reshade as I don't like to use RetroArch. It can be a little tedious to inject Reshade in emulators and other programs. Even once it's properly installed, you may have to fiddle with the settings like mask type, scan line strength, additional softening, and geometry warping. For sprite-based 2D emulators or retro compilations, then the results can look quite fantastic. BSNES seems to have its own CRT Royale filter, and it looks pretty good, especially when paired with the composite and RF filters. For 480 interlaced games, then honestly, I waive simulated interlacing as it looks more visually straining than real CRTs. Instead, I try to go for a more PVM look as progressive resolutions were supported, and I'm never going to own a PVM. I'll admit it's harder for me to dial in settings that look right as I'm more used to 240p through a CRT. Still, this is a much more visually attractive way to get a softer image to me that I much prefer. When using controllers on emulators, it can be a little annoying sometimes, mainly with setting up the input configuration. BSNES sometimes drops all input even if my controller is still connected until I pull up the input settings again. I'm less tenacious when it comes to using authentic controllers for emulators. For BSNES and DuckStation, I'm fine using a DualSense as I already use it as a PC controller. Though it can be a pain in the ass as Steam sometimes takes over all controller input and the only convenient solution is to launch an emulator through Steam to get the controller inputs to work. For Dolphin, I only use real GameCube and Wii controllers since the games were very much designed with them in mind. I was thinking of getting into PS2 emulation, but since that controller has pressure-sensitive buttons, I may nab a PS2 to USB adapter. The games on an emulator are the most legally sensitive area. Emulators themselves are 100% perfectly legal. Using games on the emulator is a little more dicey. Some say as long as you use your own backups from copies you already own, then it's fine. It's a touchy subject, and I'm not the one to ask on what's fair game or not. I can only give how I approach it. For preservation's sake, I do have full archives of all games for a few systems that I don't plan to distribute. If you want to go hunt down some ROMs, have at it. It's easy, if a little work to download all the games that you want. But for actually playing games, then I only play the games that I own. It probably goes without saying that unofficial emulators on PC are objectively better than the emulation of games you find on consoles. Not to say it's horrible, I feel NES, SNES, even N64 games are perfectly fine on Switch. Sony's emulation of PS1 games sadly peaked on PS3 and seem to have regressed since. I would not recommend playing PS1 games on PS5. The emulation is not good. The only real advantage over console emulation I can see is convenience. Even then, I'll admit, emulation on PC is getting more and more convenient. In one of my previous videos, I stated that I prefer playing games on consoles because I find it more convenient, mainly GameCube games on Wii U specifically. But shit, I may have to retract that. I mean, let's consider a real-world situation. Assuming I have the TV on and the controller ready to go, playing on real hardware has the standard steps of getting the game off the shelf, putting it in the console, setting up the video scaler with my preferred settings, and turning the console on. For Wii U, it's turning it on, waiting for the menu, selecting the game, using a damn Wiimote to start the game, and waiting for the damn Wii U to restart because it has to do that, and finally the game begins. For Dolphin, it's getting my PC to display on my TV, selecting the game on the list, and boom, game. Of course, times will vary, but shit, using an emulator in this case seems the fastest to me. This is also ignoring other factors like setting up CRT filters or having to configure other miscellaneous settings. It's also different for every emulator, but once you go through the hassle of installing the emulator, getting all your games in order, all of the settings set, your controller connected and properly mapped, and you're good to go, yeah, an emulator is as simple as selecting the game and playing it. I suppose then the only reason to play on consoles is for novelty. I'll continue to preach that the authentic feel of consoles goes a long way for me, and I'll still play games that way until it no longer becomes possible anymore. Emulators will continue to advance in game compatibility and accuracy, along with all sorts of other enhancements to boost the playing experience. Consoles are seeing hardware modifications so that they can keep up in modern gaming environments. It doesn't matter how you play your games, there's no definitive right or wrong way. My only legitimate concern for a new player playing a game is that the controls are comfortable and that input lag is low. In my experience, most casual gamers don't care about resolution or scaling or even accuracy to an extent. In that sense, consoles and emulators stand as equals. The real enemy are those dumbass multi-game devices that boast having so many games with the shittiest emulation imaginable. I'll prefer consoles, always. As little as the novelty of playing on real hardware is, it's enough for me. But I'll recognize emulators are the way of the future and will be how these games persist in the long term. I was gonna go on some tangent about how some emulators like N64 may not be that great even today, but shit, I don't know. Took only a couple minutes to get Project 64 installed, a couple more to get my games in order with a DualSense mapped in. Got my native resolution settings set up because I'm a freak like that, and feels like playing Mario 64 to me. A few minutes later, and I got Reshade installed with CRT Royale looking fine as always. Emulators are pretty good. I should probably wrap things up. Playing retro games today is easier than it's ever been if you're not fussy over playing on real hardware. If it matters as much to you as it does for me, and you're willing to put in the effort and cost, then you can never go wrong with the real deal. If I want to play Super Nintendo, I'll play on Super Nintendo. But if you want to just play some retro games, then please, just use an emulator if you're willing to deal with a learning curve if it's your first time using one. The debate over what's the ideal way to play retro games is a silly one. What matters is a gamer, controller in hand, playing some damn games. There's no correct resolution standard, no correct controller to use in most cases, and no correct format as long as the gameplay is fine. So whichever route that works best for you in order to play the games you want to play, that will always be the correct one. It's getting further interesting as we're now seeing decompilation projects to natively port retro games to PC and other systems. This opens up a ton more possibilities on how to update and alter games far beyond the limitations of emulators. I recently checked out that new Link's Awakening decomp, and it's so cool, with my first thought being, why the fuck does this have full 360 analog control and the Switch remake doesn't? I appreciate those who've watched this far. I've got a few ideas on what the next few videos will be. May take a bit as I got some PC related stuff I'd like to work on, and some games I'd like to relax with in the meantime. So until then, that should do it for me today. So all that I would like to say is thank you for watching.